You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I'm Doug Thorpe, and as always, we've got a great guest to come at you and share some wonderful information. His name is Bob Woolverton. Bob, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Doug. Thank you for having me. I've actually been looking forward to this conversation for a long time now, and I'm glad we're finally here.
As have I, and it will be a good one. And we were, I'm going to tell a story on myself, folks. We were kind of in the green room before we cranked up here, and we covered a lot of mileage. It was really good stuff. So we're going to try to recreate that for you here as we get into the material of the show. And Bob, as is somewhat tradition, before we get into the meat of the subject, give folks a little bit of your background story. What's your journey been like, and how have you gotten to where you are today?
Well, I started my career in law enforcement. I was actually second generation law enforcement, and I started in law enforcement in 1984. And in a very short period of time, I got promoted to first level supervision, then into middle management, and basically spent I think like 80+% of my career in upper management positions within law enforcement. And I also became a leadership instructor at the State Police Academy, went back to school at age 52 and got my bachelor's and master's degree in management and leadership. And that's when I actually became a leadership instructor. And because I wanted to learn everything that I could about leadership. So the interesting thing is as I look back on that career, and when I first got promoted, it's kind of like, I want to be a good leader, but how do I be a good leader? And it took me a long time to figure it out, because most of us, we are modeling the leadership behaviors that we've seen either in our current organization or somewhere else that we worked before. And that previous generation that we were trying to model our behavior on, they may not have known what they needed to know to be good leaders. And so I've really just been passionate about becoming a better leader myself all throughout my career, and helping other people become better leaders. And when I teach a class, I say on Friday afternoon, when people leave the class and they're so excited and inspired to go back to their organizations and make positive changes, that's what drives me. I mean, that is so great for me when people are inspired to make positive changes.
I agree with you, and that's why I think you and I are kindred spirits in that regard. And sounds like, some of the genesis of your motivation and interest in leadership came from that experience in law enforcement, and as did mine with the military. And when you're in an environment where the premium focus is on leadership development, above and beyond even the task at hand, it does get to be a fascination for sure. And in that environment, you really realize the value of what good leadership can mean. I mean, it is literally a life and death proposition. And, first responders, military, good leaders can save the day or get you in some serious trouble. And bad leaders get you in some serious trouble.
Well, absolutely. And particularly when you talk about life or death, whether it's the military or whether it's, public safety, first responders sort of thing. And it's not necessarily the direct direction that you give, but the culture that you create.
Right. And
so I do a whole section on culture in the organization and how, in essence, we can hire really good apples, but yet they spoil in a bad barrel. And that's that organizational culture, and to watch for the red flags where you can guide the organizational culture with just a little rudder tap, get things back on track. But if you're going to be laissez-faire leadership and kind of sit back and just assume that things are going well, that's when we have a catastrophe on our hands. And like in my class, I say a lot of times, as a result, people die.
Yeah.
Very serious stuff. Or in the private industry, maybe you have a major crisis that causes a recession, a financial collapse or something.
Exactly.
There's huge impacts.
Yeah, can be definite. And one of the reasons Bob and I connected, and I was really interested in getting him on the show, is that he's done some work in some topics of leadership that people just don't always like to talk about. And I want to definitely lean into that. And there's one in particular, Bob, that you've done a lot of work in. You want to tell us more about that?
Well, as from some of my colleagues, I get a little bit of pushback on this sometimes. But what I've noticed, because even before I went back to college to get my degrees in management and leadership, I was reading the best-selling leadership books, and I began to see a pattern when one of my colleagues, he said, leadership, it's just relationships. And at the time, I thought that was such a profound statement because it perfectly summarized, the dozen or so books we had read up to that point. But as I progressed through my leadership journey, I thought the part that's missing, the part that very few of these leadership books talk about, is providing direction to the organization. And even when I work with companies, and I'll maybe have an interview with the CEO before they hire me, and I'll ask them, so what direction did you get from the board that appointed you? What are their expectations of you? What are you trying to accomplish? And a lot of times it's kind of like deer in the headlights, like, make a lot of money. If that's your mission statement in the lobby of your building, we are here to make as much money as we can. Your customers are going to turn out, walk out the door.
Right.
But it's that providing direction. Now, the interesting thing that I've noticed throughout my career is that when we don't provide direction, our employees will fill that information void with what they think they should be doing. And they do it with the best of intentions. But if you really get down to it and ask them, how do you measure success? Everybody's got a different answer, even though they're working with the best of intentions, which means everybody's rowing in a different direction. And when you have that sort of situation, then you have silos built in an organization, morale declines, you have turnover, and it just leads to a whole lot of miserable things for an organization.
For sure. And I agree with you on that fundamental principle. And I've said it a lot about modern day workforce. I tell owners and leaders that I work with that if you've done a reasonable job hiring your team, and I know for some that can be a big if, but if you have, those people want to fundamentally do the right thing. They don't want to, as one guy once said, nobody wants to suck at their job. And people show up, they want to fundamentally do the right thing. So I like your idea, they fill the void. I sometimes go so far as to say to leaders, you got to watch out. If you feel like your team is stagnant and not going anywhere, they're not doing anything wrong, but they're not doing anything well either. It's because they don't want to do something wrong, so they might opt to do nothing.
They're flying below the radar.
In the absence of your direction, and I like your word, I think that is so critical. In the absence of the leader's direction, they might just do nothing for fear of doing something wrong.
Right. Well, this kind of
so,
relates to the conversation we were having in the green room, and the fact that I also feel that there's 3 responsibilities that come with every promotion. And it doesn't matter if it's first level supervision, whether it's middle management or all the way to the executive suite. The only thing that changes about these 3 responsibilities is the scope of influence. And so what I say the first responsibility is to focus on results. And again, that addresses that providing direction. What is it you want us to accomplish? And so in my classes, a lot of time I use a carpenter reference because people can refer to that or can relate to that. And so rather than be the technician when you're in a leadership position, and rather than telling your people how many nails to hammer and how many holes to drill, tell them, build me a house or build me a wall, or what's the outcome you want, and to focus on outcomes so that you're no longer the micromanager, because that's the number one thing the complaint that I hear from people that I talk with is micromanagement. That is number one. And it's when I go back to my promotion, I got promoted because I was a really great technician. But nobody was teaching me how to be a leader, so right. It's so easy to fall back into your comfort zone of being that technician. So that's why I say that the first responsibility, among all the other things you get when you get promoted, new reports and so on like that, is to focus on results. And that basically that focus is to provide the direction. Now, the second responsibility comes related to kind of a shift in perception. And a lot of times I hear people talk about when they get promoted, oh, I'm in charge of this function, or I'm in charge of this division. And I like to get people to think about it just a little bit differently, as you're not so much as in charge as you're responsible for. And you're responsible for the outputs or the outcomes, again, the results, but you're also responsible for the success and welfare of the people that within your scope of influence. Right. And so that second rule is to recognize that one of your responsibilities is to facilitate the success of your people. Well, that relates to something that I know you're really big on in the workplace, and that's trust. If I have a relationship with somebody that I'm responsible for, and they know that I've got their back and that I am all about their success, well, that's going to create trust in the workplace.
Right.
And that's going to create more of that, what's the word that I want, that where they basically volunteer effort. They go the extra mile because they believe in what you're doing, and they believe that you have their back, and they believe in what they're contributing to.
Yeah. That
And then
extra
the third-
mile element, by the way, let me just interject. In my book on trust at work, we talk about discretionary effort. It's
That's
that
the word
idea that they can choose to go that extra mile, and that's the zone you want to get people into.
Exactly. That was the exact word I was looking for, was that discretionary effort.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then the third responsibility is to safeguard their welfare, or safeguard their welfare, make sure that they've got the tools that they need, that everything's in working order, that, there's not hazards in the workplace, that it's absent harassment, these sorts of things. But again, that relates to that trust issue. And one of the things that I try to get people to think about is, if you have an employee, say you got a complaint on an employee, or they do a policy violation, rather than having the default mindset of, oh my gosh, Doug messed this up again. Doug, Doug, why did you do that? Is stop and think a moment and look in the mirror basically and say, what was my culpability in this? Is there a flaw in our system or our processes that in essence, there was no way this employee could have survived? And, somewhere down the road, maybe we terminate that person. We'll think, oh, we fixed that problem, but no, it pops up again because it was systemic in the processes we created. So we need to look at, is there something I could have done or should have done that would have prevented this employee crisis in essence? And again, look internally or look in the mirror. What's my culpability in this? And so many times when we get promoted, we think we know everything, or we know the best. And, we've created these systems that are, they can't possibly be improved on. But a lot of times, if you really step back and take a look at it, there was no malice on the employee's part.
Right. Yeah. It's that set up to fail kind of idea. And I love your point about the leader being responsible for creating that opportunity for success. If you as a leader can't eliminate roadblocks and hindrances and obstacles that keep your team from performing at its best, then that's a fundamental flaw in your own, leadership approach.
Yeah. Well, you had a guest on your show not too long ago. His name was Kevin Palmieri.
Yeah.
And he said something in the podcast that really resonated with me. That's right on topic with this. He goes, in relationships, I'm 50% of all my failed relationships.
Yeah.
And so again, that's looking in the mirror. And I thought, wow, that is so similar to the idea of what's my culpability in this event. Right. I could be 50% of the problem here, And there's actually a leadership book that I think, as far as a beginning level for leadership, is an awesome resource for people. And it's called Leadership and Self-Deception. And it's by the Arbinger Institute. But what it basically says is, you might be part of the problem. Take time to look in the mirror. And so when your guest, Kevin, was saying that I'm 50% of all my failed relationships, that is so on point with what I try to get people to do, is step back a moment and think, is there something I could have done or should have done that could have prevented this from occurring? And particularly, if it's a crisis situation, we want to make sure, do whatever it takes that we identify it so it doesn't happen again.
Business is all about solving complex problems as fast as you can create them. Become the best problem solver by leading others to greatness too. And the first step is going to DougThorpe.com. Doug Thorpe is known globally for coaching entrepreneurs and business leaders, improving their performance and the work output of everyone surrounding them. You can find health, wealth, and happiness by learning to lead others to health, wealth, and happiness. Go to DougThorpe.com now and order Doug's books or hire him to coach your managers. That's DougThorpe.com.
That word self-deception, it is an interesting one, and I just happened to have recently watched a video that Simon Sinek did, an interview he was part of, and he was talking about a company that he studied, and he came away with that same idea. We as leaders, we've got to watch out for that self-deception of we do all this work to define what good leadership ought to be, what our leadership framework should look like, the help define the culture we want to drive to create. And, we can be subject to finding just ever so small indicators that it's working. And we take that to the bank, and it's like, no, you just got started. You're not there yet.
Well, that kind of sounds like the phrase that I firmly believe is that everybody you meet knows something you don't know.
Yeah.
There's always room to learn. And I have literally had chief executives sit in my class, and they kind of sit back with their arms folded like, you can't teach me anything. I already know everything. And I thought, oh gosh, it's so disappointing for your organization.
Right.
Even, with my decades of experience in, my academic work, I don't know everything. I'm still learning,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, supposedly Sinek, as his story went on, he said he got to know this CEO, and the CEO said, I'm doing everything you talk about on developing teams and our environment and our trust and our performance. And so Simon accepted an invitation to come tour facilities. And this was a manufacturing company that had multiple locations all over the country. And on the CEO's dime and with his private jet, they went around to all these places, and the doors were open, and Simon could walk around, interview anybody, ask them anything, and sure enough, it was all just nirvana. It was all these aspirational values of leadership and exchange and trust and collaboration. So they wrapped this thing up with a huddle of all the leadership team, and Simon says, there's one thing that comes to my mind that you're not going to be happy when I tell you. And they said, what's that? And he said, yes, you have achieved all this. And now what I'm going to tell you is you're too damn selfish. You need to go tell others how to do this.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. I just kind of came across this recently because I've heard people say, when their leadership is mentored in their organization, a lot of times it's like, I'm not going to be that person, or I'm not going to treat my people that way. So they know what they don't want to do, but is there an opportunity for them to figure out what it is they do want to do? And I think that's where some of these challenges are, because, for example, in one of the blocks of instruction that I deal with, I've got a Venn diagram that's got characteristics of a leader and then characteristics of a middle manager, of a manager, and then the few that overlap between the two in the Venn diagram, and then ask the students to list out the characteristics of the best leader they'd ever worked for. And the very first one on the left side under leadership is vision. And almost without exception, nobody ever lists vision. And it's like, for leadership, that is so critical. And that's my definition of leadership is the capacity to be able to translate vision into reality. So in your example with Simon Sinek, obviously that leader figured out where they were going, what they were going to do, what they're going to accomplish, how they're going to do it. And it was working. But in so many environments that I see, the vision just isn't there. So it's like, where are we going? And that's where we were talking in the green room, as far as leadership, a critical foundation of leadership is when you come to that fork in the road, when the work environment has changed or the competitive environment has changed, and you come to that fork in the road and the leader says, we're going this direction. Well, now you got to figure out how to make that happen. But it's not like, being empathetic and transparent is absolutely necessary, but somebody's got to make the decision. Somebody's got to decide where we're going and then translate that into reality.
Well, back to the main point, and you call it, I think, one of the areas people don't like to talk about when they talk about leadership. We talk about all these great and wonderful attributes on building relationships and empathy and communication and all that, but that ability to create direction, but more specifically, execute on the advancement down that path. It is such a critical element. As an example, real quick, I often am asked by leaders, they'll come to me and they'll say, well, we're going through a big change and I'm stuck, and what do you know about change management and how can we manage that? There's an old simple model that it looks like an algebraic equation. It's D times V times F has to be greater than R, and R is the resistance to change. So you ask yourself, what are the other three variables? The first one, D, is dissatisfaction. How bad is the current situation? If that is high, you're likely you got a running start at making the change and getting through with getting over and past the resistance. But sometimes dissatisfaction is not that great, so you still want to make the change. What do? Well, V is the vision part, and leaders that don't do well casting the vision of what the opportunity may look like, that's a problem. But what I argue is when it comes to making change, usually leaders do a reasonable job of describing the change they want to make, but that's where they stop it. And then they shoot the gun and they say, go, and let's make this, and everybody gets confused. So that's where the third variable is so important, and that's the F, and it means first steps. Cast my vision, but now I want to show you the first steps we've already figured out. This is how we're going to move down this fork in the road and go to the left and turn and take this new path. Having that extra quantum creation of those first steps, that's part of that giving direction, saying, here's how we're going to go.
Absolutely. And that's part of, referring to strategic planning. And matter of fact, I've got an article. I'm trying to remember which institution wrote the article, but it says a lot of leaders don't even begin on strategic planning because either A, they don't understand it, or it feels like it's going to be too complex or whatever. But the reality of it is doing something's better than doing nothing. The vast majority of businesses in our country are small businesses, and it doesn't have to be really complex. Now, of course, big corporations that have a market cap of billions, if not trillions of dollars, they have a very complex strategic plan, but those are the exceptions because there's not that many huge companies, right, in our world. And but one of the things that you were saying on that is that idea of translating the need for the change or conveying the need. So if we're not basically conveying, well, this is what will happen if we don't make this change, and the employers are going like, well, we might be out of business. Well, then, that might be more motivating, to participate in that change and contribute to that to make it happen.
Yeah. I want to change gears and go back to a comment you made earlier in the discussion here. One about you said you yourself got promoted into that first leadership role because of transactional expertise or the ability to be the technician. I think technician was the word. Mm-hmm. And I totally agree that is the fundamental blueprint that everybody follows. I've got a business, I've got an army of people working for me, I've got a need for a frontline supervisor. Where do I find them? I go pick the brightest producer, the best producer, the best technician, and poof, I make them a supervisor and give them a pat on the shoulder and say, good luck, let's make this work. And they're sitting there with their heads spinning going, what do I do? And sadly, I'll extrapolate it a few iterations further. What ends up happening in my mind and what I've observed is a lot of people, they double down on the technical delivery part, and they certainly work to get their team to deliver, but they take on a portfolio of their own or a share of the workload. They keep producing, and then again, time goes on and poof, they get promoted yet again. So it becomes this self-fulfilling logic that says, if I keep doing that, I'm going to, keep getting promoted. Okay, that's what I'll do. But in fact, what starts happening, the company starts asserting these subtle hints that, no, you don't need to be the technician. I need you to be the leader. I need you to focus on developing this team or expanding this team or growing the reach and impact of that team. And that middle manager guy gets really confused really fast. It's emotionally unsettling. It's functionally unsettling. It's a lot of confusion.
That's an excellent point that you make. I hadn't looked at it from the perspective of the person being promoted. In essence, they are being rewarded for the behavior that technically we don't want. And to get back to your technician example, that our top salesperson, they're usually the ones that gets promoted to be the sales manager, and then they get promoted to be, the district manager or something like that. And I had always looked at it from the fact that it was because they were a great technician. I never even looked at it from the perspective that you were saying, that it's almost like the treat and the reward sort of thing is that they're not focusing on results. They're still being a technician, and yet they get promoted again and maybe again. And so it's kind of a compounding problem. Tell me more about that. Obviously, I haven't looked at it from that perspective.
Well, so what I've done with the middle and slightly upper management types now obviously we're talking about larger, perhaps even global companies that have these layers. What I will inevitably do with those people, if I get the opportunity to watch them engage with their team, I will ask them the question, are you leading or are you solving another problem? And what will happen is the direct reports. So, okay, I'm looking at a middle manager. He's got 5 direct reports, and they each have teams of directs and those are the frontline supervisor guys. So we're talking of an organization of maybe 50 people that roll up to my person. And one of those directs comes to my client and says, I've got this problem, blah, blah, blah. What would you do? And inevitably, if it's unprompted and unannounced, and I'm just observing, my client will immediately go to solution mode. Oh, well, you need to call so-and-so and do this, do that, go here, go there, boom, you're done, boom, have a nice day. And intuitively, you think that's efficient, that's effective. We just solved a problem. Hey, this is great. And I say, nay. I say to my people, yeah, but did they learn how to solve that problem? Did they learn anything from that exchange? All they learned was you might have introduced a new name to them, or you might have suggested a new tack, but what was your thought process for delivering that solution? What was the waterfall logic that went through your brain when you gave them those nuggets to go do? And would it be better for you to say, that does sound like a problem. What have you considered already? Who have you already talked to? What have you already tried doing? And get them to work through some other options that ultimately become that cascade of logic that can be imparted for future problem solving.
Yeah, I call that enhancing somebody's decision-making matrix. In essence,
Yeah.
all the columns of criteria that they're considering. And if the supervisor or the manager can solve the problem, well, it's because they've got a couple different columns of criteria that they're evaluating to be able to solve that problem. And specifically what you're saying, are you sharing that or broadening that employee's decision-making matrix in essence? So now they know, and so what I used to do is when I used to be a field training officer and you're just about ready to let a new police officer out on their own, you kind of let them handle the call and they come back and they go, okay, this is what I learned. I interviewed this person, I learned A, B, and C, and I interviewed this person, I learned E, F, and G, and this is my plan of action. Well, if there's something that's missing, well, then you add that extra criteria and say, well, now what if tomorrow morning somebody comes in and declares X, Y, and Z? I go, hadn't thought about that. Well, considering that, well, then I would do this. Perfect. Go forward and do good. So you've just expanded their decision-making matrix.
Exactly.
But it's so much easier to just solve the problem because it's quick. But in the long run, you're not helping that employee. You're not coaching that employee to someday basically, to replace you and fill your shoes.
Right. No development. And I had done that with an executive at one of the large oil and gas companies, and it was just coincidental. I had an appointment with him, and I was turning the corner to walk into his space, and he had one of these corner offices with 2 panels of glass on two of the sides, and one of his people was walking out of the door as I was walking in, and He told me, first thing he told me, he said, I saw you coming down the hall and I was getting ready to solve that person's problem. And when I saw you, I said, no, we're going to go through this drill. And he started asking questions. He said, and he said, I think I've got it now. I think I've got it. So,
well, I would call that a success on your part.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Bob, we're about up on time here. Unfortunately, this has just been incredible, and I know I could go on for much longer at this, but tell folks the best way to get a hold of you if they're interested in learning more.
Well, first, before they do that, I would say whatever platform they're listening to this program, whether it's a podcast or they're watching a video or whatever, right now, stop and hit subscribe, leave a comment, that sort of thing. And then once you've done that, then you can get a hold of me at toptierleadershiptraining.com or on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's probably the easiest to find me, Bob Woolverton. Super easy to find. 2 O's in the last name, W-O-O-L, not in the first name, in the second name.
Yeah. Subtle joke there, folks, if you spell it out and think about it. Well, Bob, that's great. And we will have that information in the show notes, folks, if you didn't catch it on the fly there. Bob, I'm going to give you one last shot. Kind of wrap this up and put a bow on it. What do you think the big message people ought to take away about their own leadership development?
Well, I firmly believe in those 3 responsibilities that come with every promotion. And so I mentioned, focus on results, because again, that's indeed providing direction. Safeguard or facilitate the success of your people, and then safeguard their welfare. And when you do those 3 things, so if you do it as a first level supervisor, you're looking out for your team or your squad. And as a middle manager, you're doing the exact same thing. It's just for more people. And maybe it's the entire division or multiple divisions. And then as the CEO, again, it's the results of the entire organization and facilitating their success and so on. So the only thing that changes is the scope. And so I think the big message is, if we get out of that mindset that I'm in charge, that I know everything, but that I'm responsible for the outcomes and the results, and I'm responsible for the success of my people, and I'm responsible to facilitate or to safeguard their welfare. I think those are, no matter where you are in the organization, that will turn around to pay huge dividends all the way around. Because leadership, there's a whole, it's like 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. There's a lot of little pieces to make that big picture. But if you can do those 3 things, I think you're off to a great start. And again, that comes right back to that trust. When your people believe that you have their back, that they can trust you to give them the benefit of the doubt and facilitate their success, the organization will benefit immensely.
Very good. Well, Bob, again, thank you so much.
Hey, Doug, it's been a pleasure. I can't believe we're out of time already. Let's do this again sometime.
I think we'll need to. We'll probably do a second edition here soon. But
okay, well, you know where to find me.
So, folks, our show is, as Bob alluded to, if you're listening on your favorite audio streaming, we're certainly present on video as well over on YouTube, channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Hop over there, subscribe, give us a like or a comment. Or you don't have to like it. You can say so. I'm a big boy. I'll take your findings and we'll talk about it. But would love to have you engage with us. And I always like to ask if you or someone you know would be a good guest on the show. Let me know that too. And for now, we're going to sign off, say goodbye, and thank you for listening. Hope to see you again real soon.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.